Hello and welcome back to A Better World. This is your host, Mitchell J. Rabin, and I'm very glad you're joining us again today. Today we're going to have another very interesting show, and very timely as well. We have with us in our studio, Helena Norberg Hodge. Helena is a very interesting woman. She's an analyst of the new economy, the new economics. She has been playing a very vital role, actually, at this point for decades, in the development of the thinking about and the development of local economies around the world. And she's played really a leading role in speaking with heads of state, with ministers of all sorts, agriculture, energy, etc., to help bring this about on both the higher levels as well as grassroots. Her organization, Localfutures.org, goes into some depth about these kinds of initiatives. She is the recipient of the Goy Award in 2012. She has been a recipient as well of the Right Livelihood Award, which is considered to be the alternative Nobel Prize. And in short, she has been an author, a filmmaker, and a pioneer in shifting the whole idea of globalization back into a kind of economy that is much more manageable, much more ecological, much more essentially energy efficient in its purport and its ability to actually serve people. So it's a great pleasure to have you on, Helena.
Thank you. Very good to be here.
I'm so glad. It's nice to come to a better world, isn't it?
It is, absolutely. Love it.
I'm so glad. So you've been doing such amazing work for a long time and helping to forward the conversation, both, ideologically as well as actually, in grassroots action. Your last film, The Economics of Happiness, really gives a beautiful bird's eye view of what's going on and who the players are and what are the motivating factors inside the global corporate banking arena that are really oppressing people at large. What would you say to our audience about what they ought to know about what you see going on now, and what are the solutions we need to follow up with?
Well, I guess the first thing I'd like to say to the audience is that it is really helpful and empowering if we start looking a bit more deeply and a bit more broadly at what's going on in the world. Because if we don't, we feel completely overwhelmed by just one crisis after another. I mean, we're bombarded with images and fear around global warming, and now we have all kinds of diseases. We've got unemployment, we have job insecurity, and all of these issues, the widening gap between rich and poor, loss of democracy. So all of these, if we see them as separate crises, we can feel totally depressed and overwhelmed. But there is a way of understanding how all of this has come about, which links all these problems together into one dominant system. And it really is a techno-economic system that has become a sort of global, almost like an empire. And the main reason this has happened is because we have not been aware of how that was created. And that's been mainly through trade treaties. So there's a very strategic
Or that
way.
it was even being created.
That's right.
It was very much behind closed doors.
Exactly. So we weren't even aware that this was going on, and we were too busy watching left and right political shows and discussions about issues that were not addressing what was happening to the economy and the fundamental importance about what happened to the economy in terms of how much we pay for our housing, for our food, whether our children have a chance of getting a job or not. These vitally important questions were not being discussed on either the left or the right. So it's a really, really empowering journey to go on, to realize that if we focus on making an economic shift, a systemic shift, away from supporting a globalizing path towards supporting a path towards what I call localizing, there is a trajectory there, there's a matrix there that's incredibly hopeful. First of all, grasping that intellectually is very important. But then once we become attuned to that, we'll see that there are all kinds of things happening that demonstrate that it's possible for human beings to simultaneously reduce energy consumption, reduce resource consumption generally, in other words, reduce our ecological impact, while increasing the quality of life, while increasing the opportunities for meaningful, secure livelihoods. So that is what I want people to think about.
That's
it's
a
very
beautiful
big
frame.
picture,
Yeah, it's a very
really
valuable
important.
frame because, in so many of these kinds of conversations, it's chicken and the egg, and you don't know where it actually began.
Yeah.
But there really is a point of departure for a shift.
Yes.
And, it's kind of funny because a lot of what you're doing and what I'm doing as well through A Better World and other activities of mine is we're going back to the way things were.
Yeah.
In some way, the whole idea of a local economy is absolutely not new. It's the way life always was until this thing called globalization began to set in. You want to comment on that?
I would like to comment on that because what to me is so exciting is that what we're going towards in many structural ways is like going back to what was there, which means that it's practically not so difficult.
Right.
But in many other ways, we're doing it with a new ecological consciousness.
Yes.
We're doing it with cultural values that have changed dramatically, where there is much greater respect, not just for women, but for the feminine, for the nurturing, for the cooperative.
Yes.
We're doing it in a way
point.
that has we have really developed in terms of our cultural values in a very positive way. And we can take that with us on a journey that transforms the economic structures in such a way that those values can shape the economy. Right now, we're in a very, dangerous situation because mainly through blindness, by not understanding how this was happening and not looking at it, we've allowed economic and technological forces to overwhelm government, to overwhelm our media, to overwhelm even academia. So almost every avenue of knowledge has been colonized by a sort of for-profit, very, very destructive worldview. And this is the main reason why we are where we are. So we can change. I mean, information and awareness can travel very quickly. Partly through programs like yours, through the internet. I feel hopeful that we may be able to get a different way of looking at things out very rapidly and start practically supporting the localization movement.
That is actually a nice segue, Helena, into the fact that your organization is sponsoring and producing an event called Voices of Hope, which is taking place at the Great Hall of Cooper Union on November 8th.
That's right.
So
and it's called Voices of Hope in a time of crisis.
At a time of crisis,
especially laying out exactly this big
we'll
picture.
put on some information about that here too.
And I really hope people will come. We've got some wonderful, inspiring people there, including a clinical psychologist from Nigeria who has a deep understanding not only of the individual epidemic of depression, but the cultural self-rejection that's going on in many cultures. You've got Charles Eisenstein, who's a very charismatic and very interesting new thinker in the new
Catherine
economy.
Ingram,
Catherine
who
Ingram,
brings the mindfulness aspect to it.
I always describe her as a sort of female Eckhart Tolle. A very sort of pared down, very intelligent form of spirituality.
Beautiful woman. She's been on the show a number of times. You have a number of really... Chris Hedges has been on our show as well. Brilliant.
Yes,
brilliant thinker.
Chris Hedges is speaking,
Man of brilliant mind and big heart, too.
Yeah.
I'd like to come back to something you were saying about the sort of the origins of globalization, and then we're going back to... What I think you're actually implying is that we're not really going back to anything. It's all really a forward movement. It's a Hegelian dialectic that we would go from all local to almost all global. And so the synthesis then is a local global conversation that's empowering to people so we can bring forward our new cultural values, our new attitudes, alignment with the feminine, which is not something we had traditionally,
Yeah.
and the value of technology. Technology is a very good thing when used with love and responsibility.
Yeah, but I would say that in a certain way there is a going back, but I'm seeing that as going back to ancient, nature-based, more indigenous cultures, and that's particularly where my experience sort of comes from.
Yeah.
And there are certain characteristics that are really vital, I think, for our health, for our happiness, and they have to do with rebuilding the community fabric. And they have to do with rebuilding intergenerational relationships and community relationships in such a way that every human being feels seen and heard and appreciated. And it's particularly important for children. You know, in a world where children are being influenced by media images and advertising, we are creating a desperate self-rejection and a desperate desire to be loved and to belong, but going down a consumer path, because the media says to young children, whether in Mongolia or Tibet or New York City
or Ladakh,
if you want to be loved and want to have the acceptance and admiration of your peer group, you've got to have the latest running shoes, you've got to have the latest iPad, you've got to have the latest this.
Exactly.
And as they go running down that path, searching for love, respect, and connection, they end up being envied, and it's a source of envy and separation, not of connection and love. So really what's happening in this commercial global system is that we're perverting what is truly a universal human need, which is the universal human need to be loved, into a universal need to consume. And in the process, of course, you know, we're destroying the planet, but deeply, deeply damaging ourselves. So in terms of going back, I think we evolved in groups. We evolved not in isolated little, consumer units, but in a bigger, broader way. And that communion included a much deeper relationship to animals, to plants, to
nature
the living world, to nature. And we can regain that.
I understand what you mean.
Yeah.
That indigenous nature is in all communities all over the world historically. So that part of it, I completely agree with you.
Yeah.
And, you know, your work in Ladakh, I would love for you to tell the story about that, because that was such a clear kind of regression really, but a progression from a harmonious, sustainable, indigenous community where I love what you say in your film, basically, there was no unemployment.
Yeah.
Well, there was no unemployment because everyone was part of a family, and every family had its role in the larger community, whether they were farmers or they took care of shoes or clothing, or, you know, everybody had their role. So, of course, there was no unemployment. You would just do what your family was doing. And you could say that was very limiting, and there's a good point to that. And so the new localization, which is, of course, a word that you use in your film, is enriched by some of the changes that have happened in society, matching with the love and sense of connectedness that occurs in the indigenous context.
Yeah.
But could you talk about that trend? Because you really witnessed some of that transition.
I did. I mean, I witnessed it, and in many ways I witnessed what in most parts of the world took 500 years, because Ladakh, which is western Tibet, it's up on the Tibetan plateau, and culturally Tibetan, had been sealed off from the modern world, and they had not been colonized before that. So here was a very rare situation of a culture that had evolved and changed. There's always change in every culture, you know, over hundreds of years, but changing according to its own terms, not through an invasion of colonial power or an invasion of this dominant economy. Anyway, I arrived there just as this area was thrown open to the modern world.
Which was when?
In 1975. And I was a linguist. I came out originally as part of a film team. I was only going to stay for 6 weeks to help make the film. But I was just
Do they speak Tibetan, by the way?
They speak an ancient form of Tibetan. So
Ancient
it's
form.
related, but it's closer to the classical ancient Tibetan.
Is it like Romansh related to Latin?
Yes, you could say, or even like Italian and French related to Latin.
Oh, okay.
And so in the whole Tibetan area, in Bhutan, Nepal, Central Tibet, there were all these different dialects that were a bit like French, Italian, Spanish. But anyway, I was a linguist and I learned languages quickly, and I just fell in love with the people. I had never encountered people who just radiated this sort of deep lightness, joy, and deep self-esteem, just such a relaxed way of being, and so full of humor and joy. I mean, I was just fascinated and fell in love with them. So I decided.
Buddhist as well?
Oh yeah, the Dalai Lama is the spiritual head.
Oh,
I mean,
okay.
this is part of Tibet. So the Dalai Lama is the spiritual head. And I also met the Dalai Lama. I guess that was in the second year. But really, most of the people I met were like the Dalai Lama. It was just this radiance that just attracted. I mean, almost everyone who came fell in love with the people. And I was lucky enough to be told by, there was a professor of Tibetology out there from University of London, and he said I could do a PhD on the language. So I stayed when the film was finished, and I ended up staying out in that part of the world for 2 years before I went back to Europe. But I ended up really going back almost every year for the last 40 years. So I've seen huge changes there, and they have been, they've forced me to see this bigger picture, because in Ladakh I witnessed how subsidized goods brought in on subsidized roads, you know, how the whole system subsidizes the big players, subsidizes transport and trade. And so then you get products coming in from the other side of the Himalayas costing half the price of local products. So suddenly the local market is destroyed. And at the same time, in come these images that tell people that if they are not white and Western and, you know, urban consumers, they are not worth anything. They're backward, primitive, and stupid.
They're not good enough.
They're not good enough. So these psychological pressures and the structural pressures create intense competition locally. And so I have seen, starting in Ladakh, I have seen how this economic system lies behind so much of the local ethnic friction, fundamentalism, and even violence. I literally saw how Buddhists and Muslims who had lived in Ladakh side by side for 500 years suddenly started killing each other out of this combination of psychological and material pressures. In Bhutan, where I also worked over a 5-year period, I saw the same thing happening in the same time period. They were also suddenly thrown open to the outside economy. And this has, of course, made me passionate to try to get the word out. What I've seen, I wrote a book called Ancient Futures, and we made a film called Ancient Futures. And between them, the book and the film have been translated into 50 languages, which is quite unusual. And from all these groups from around the world, from Burma to Peru to Mongolia and so on, I've been told again and again, the story you tell is our story too. And it's so clear that for men in particular, if you rob people of self-esteem and the ability to provide for themselves and their families, they often just turn violent. And often the violence will be against the other, you know, whether it's the outside immigrant, whether it's the other, you know, whether it's neo-Nazis now in
They
Eastern
identify
Europe.
a culprit.
They identify a culprit. And very often they'll even turn on their own women and children and oppress them out of this intense frustration. So I think it's so important that we understand what this economic system is doing. Also understand that it is practically easier to shift towards a localizing path. It would cost less money. It would work with the needs of nature, with the deep needs that we have as human beings,
emotionally, psychologically,
for connection and community. So it actually be easier practically. It's all about changing our thoughts, and I also believe that change will come from people's movements. We can't wait and rely on government, and at the moment I don't even think there's any point talking to government. We should be talking to each other. to build up enough of a movement to then demand change. Getting this message out, that both global warming and unemployment are linked.
Yes,
and
exactly.
that it just needs a shift in subsidies and taxes.
Yes.
I just think most people would agree, and we could have a very powerful movement if we can just get people to look at this boring thing called the economy.
Right, exactly. No, you're making such fine points. And the economy is actually, when thinking of a living economy, it's actually a lot of fun.
Yeah.
But the way the banking system has kind of established it and propagandized it, it's not fun at all. Something you kind of want to run away from. But the fact is, when people produce things, they produce artwork, they produce beauty, they produce beautiful food, there's a great joy in sharing. And even if you're charging money for it, that's okay.
That's fine.
This is a natural part of the cycle,
Absolutely.
I'm thinking, Helena, of both the work of David Korten, who when he wrote I think it was in the mid-'80s, When Corporations Rule the World, when he was in, maybe it was Indonesia or Southeast Asia for sure.
Southeast Asia.
Yeah, and he was attending a conference, and he was working, I think at that time, for the State Department.
Yeah.
And he thought the exportation of Western capitalist business know-how was going to actually help all of these other, third world poor people.
Yeah.
And he found that it was just the opposite, and that the Western capitalists, if you will, knew full well that they weren't improving these places. I think I remember a story where he was talking about speaking to a high executive of Coca-Cola or Pepsi. And I know they wouldn't like those to be confused, but I confuse them all the time. And the guy said, we know we're not improving their lives. We're getting cheap labor. Sort of like, wake up, man. What's wrong with you? And that's what set him, David Korten, into another perspective. I might be messing up the story a little bit, but in a sense, this is the essence of it. And he began to think, oh my God, what have I've been missing? I've been not reading the signs all along. And that's when he flipped into his other, worldview, thankfully.
And this is also for me, so many people I work with have had this experience of living in the West and in another culture that's been, as it were, less developed. And it gives a perspective.
So-called third world.
Yeah, it gives a perspective. It really helps you see more clearly that behind the sort of discussion at the political level lies this economic trajectory.
Yes, a huge machine.
And you don't have to be an economist to understand it.
No.
And even though it's a huge machine, it is very, very vulnerable because it really doesn't serve the needs of not even 1% of the population.
Yes, it's really true.
So we, the 99%,
That's a really important
are crazy if we let it continue.
Somebody recently said, Helena, it's not 1% 99. It's about 0.01%,
yes, that's right.
99.99.
That's right.
That's
exactly.
really what it is.
Absolutely.
We're talking about a few thousand families worldwide that are really the engineers behind the thing,
Yeah. Although I actually, my experience and talking to a lot of people, also within the World Bank and so on, it's not so much that it's a group of families. It's much more to do with the structure of the corporation, as David so brilliantly showed, and also the film, The Corporation. So it's not so much about individual people or individual families. It's this crazy structure that exists only for profit. And as a CEO, when you're in that structure, if you try to go against that mandate, you're just out.
Well,
so
you're right.
we as society need new rules for business.
I rewrote that, it really comes down to a small phrase that is in the corporate sort of minutes, not quite minutes, but in the charter to be a legal corporation, which, by the way, used to be a privilege of the state, I recently learned.
Yeah.
I thought it was a really interesting thing. So it would be in service to the public. As a public corporation, you're in service by definition. But they then added a phrase, which we both know well, which is that the officers of the corporation will work for the greatest profit of its shareholders. And I excised that phrase and I put in a smart, humanitarian, eco-friendly, that it will, the officers will work for the betterment of all beings, all sentient life, and the ecological sustainability of our planet, and profit. Profit's fine, but it's within the context of humanitarianism. You know,
and part of that has so much to do with scale. I mean, this is where localization is important. We've got to try to see more clearly that it's the trade treaties that allowed big businesses to become bigger and bigger, because what those treaties are about, in the name of free trade, what we're doing is giving corporations and banks the freedom to move in and out of local and national economies without any boundaries. And now with the new treaties... And
no accountability.
No accountability. I often talk about it, our arms are so long we can't see what our hands are doing. We need to bring the economy home to a scale where we can see, where the banker who lends money knows who he's lending to, knows the name of the people, has some idea what's happening.
The way it used to be.
Yeah, where the consumer...
It's a Wonderful Life with Jimmy Stewart. You know, they knew everybody, you know. In our last moments, what is going on with Ladakh? I mean, this is unfair, but is Ladakh now, with the work of your organization and others, I'm no doubt, helping to restore the way life was?
I wouldn't say that. I couldn't say that as a collective thing. No, we did a lot of work, and we helped to set up a lot of NGOs that are doing brilliant work, and there is this sort of countercurrent. But I'd say what's happening in Ladakh is similar to what's happening right here. And that is that the dominant system and the heavy money from the top is still pushing in the wrong direction. That there are lots of wonderful initiatives that are working in the opposite direction. So it's a question of, you know, over the next few years, are we going to get a stronger movement both here and in Ladakh? That's the big issue.
Well, Helena, thank you so much for the great work that you're doing on behalf of everyone.
Well, really, thank you for what you're doing. It's fabulous, because one of the most important things is getting the word out.
Exactly. That is my role. One of them. Yeah, exactly. This coming November 8th at the Great Hall at Cooper Union, Voices of Hope at a Time of Crisis. You have the information on our website at abetterworld.tv. Please look it up and become part of it. This is Mitchell J. Rabin for A Better World. Thanks so much for joining us. Make sure to write to me at mjr@abetterworld.net. Share your thoughts, comments. Always love hearing from you. And make sure to get on the newsletter. Look forward to seeing you all